All right, welcome everybody to another one of our virtual programs. As many of you know, in December, we announced the formation of the We Roar Together, an initiative to address and reaffirm the commitment to diversity, racial justice, equity, and inclusion within the Department of Intercollegiate Athletics and Physical Education. We're looking forward to engaging in some conversations over the next couple of months, and we are happy to kick it off with a topic of athlete activism. Everyone here today has a link to athlete activism, and I'm sure many of you are watching who have engaged in activism in some way. We're grateful for Associate Professor of History at Columbia University, Frank Guridy, who is here with us tonight to moderate our discussion, as well as men's basketball alum, Alton Bird, women's fencing alum and former Olympian, Nzingha Prescod, and also men's football alum, Tyler Holmes. So Frank, I will turn it over to you, and thank you to everybody and our panelists, and we look forward to the discussion this evening. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Peter. Thanks for asking me to participate as a moderator of this important discussion. As Peter said, I'm Frank Guridy. I'm Associate Professor of History and African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia. I've been faculty here at Columbia for now 5 years. It's going by very fast. A lot of things have happened in those 5 years, and a lot of things as they pertain to sports and activism. So I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation with three of our distinguished alums. So I'm going to kind of lead us through the session. We've got plenty of questions that I'm going to ask. There's some questions that were submitted as well. But before we do that, I'd like to give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell us about some of their achievements, and then we will resume the conversation. I figured maybe we could start with, in reverse alphabetical order. We'll start with Nzingha.
Hey everyone, I'm Nizinga Prescott. I'm a two-time Olympic fencer and world medalist, multi-time world medalist. I'm a Brooklyn native, so I've lived in the city my whole life. I'm a Columbia alumni. I graduated from Stuyvesant High School also. I'm an advocate for equity in sports, primarily through increasing access to sports, high quality, high performance sports. That's always been my passion. I grew up in the Peter Westbrook Foundation, and Peter financed my training since I was 9 years old, and that's how I was able to become the fencer I am today. But I've always wanted to increase that access, and so that's been kind of where I've targeted my activism. I'm also working in sports governance. I'm serving on the USA Fencing Board of Directors, and my priorities are to increase representation in the national offices, but also on boards, committees, teams, any decision-making capabilities, having more diverse representation to make those decisions. So that's me in a nutshell.
Super, thank you. Let's go to Tyler.
Hi everyone, my name is Tyler Holmes. Graduated Columbia College, class of 2018. I was a proud member of the Columbia Lions football team, and I'm definitely proud to say, when we were there, we made some things happen. So I'm definitely proud of that. And in my regular day-to-day, right now I'm a third grade teacher in the Bronx. I have my own business, photography, videography, and inspiring film director. So you can say I'm a little in the arts as well. And then, on a day-to-day basis, I'm constantly, I would say fighting for racial equality. I'm a member of an activist group here in New York City called Strategy for Black Lives. And, on a day-to-day, we are marching, we are protesting, we're fighting for policy reform. And it means a lot to us. We constantly think about these things throughout our day-to-day, especially this past year. It's been a lot in a nutshell, but we continue to fight as we should. And so I'm definitely glad and thankful to be here.
Thank you, Tyler. Alton.
Yeah, I'm the oldest of the band here. This is a very, very interesting and collaborative band that I'm a part of this evening. I'm Alton Bird, and I am from California originally and made the journey across country to play basketball at Columbia and get my education. I played college basketball, obviously, at Columbia. I'm a three-time first-team All-Ivy basketball player and the nation's best player in 1979, under 6 feet. I then transferred that after being drafted by the Boston Celtics, went to Europe, played in Europe professionally for 18 years. I have been a player, head coach, general manager, team owner. Presently, I work at BSE Global, part of the Tsai family sports portfolio and business portfolio. Joe Tsai and Clara Wu Tsai, who are huge advocates for equity, economic empowerment. And I'm an advocate for education, health and wellness, and to impact young audiences around the real importance around literacy, both education, reading, and financial, also around the law and the impact of how the law makes a huge difference to our young people today. And I'm also part of and the creator of an anti-racism platform on Long Island called Team Up for Unity, trying to eradicate racism in Long Island high schools. And I am a proud team. I oversee growth properties at BSE Global, which is the NBA G League team, the Long Island Nets, and our esports team, Nets 2K, as part of the NBA's 2K League.
Thank you, Alton. So we're going to hear a lot more about the work that you folks are doing in your day-to-day and your careers. I love the way Tyler put it, day-to-day work, because indeed, activist work is day-to-day work. Even if you're not in an activist position, whatever that is. So as I said earlier, I'm a historian, so I'm going to put this little conversation in historical context, if I could do that, and then I'd like us to start a discussion, because I do think. And I'm going to use an overused word that we've heard a lot since last year. We're in an unprecedented moment in the history of this country, in the history of sports and activism, and we're at a critical moment, I think. And sports clearly can and has already played a role in the transformation that we've seen developing in this country, not just last year, indeed, really almost since 2013. Since for almost a decade, since the murder of Trayvon Martin, we've seen an extraordinary movement of athlete activism in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. In 2016, of course, WNBA players Carolyn Swords, Kia Stokes, Tina Charles, Tanisha Wright, and Swin Cash spoke out against police violence that summer. Then, of course, later that summer, the well-known case of Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee during the national anthem in NFL games, and he received enormous persecution from fans and from the league, and he has never played a game since that season. I also have to mention, of course, the profound impact of the Me Too movement in highlighting the prevalence of sexual assault and sexual violence and harassment in the world of sports. And then, of course, last year, we saw the extraordinary movement that emerged in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, which led to further solidarity protests, unprecedented labor activism with the strike of the Milwaukee Bucks and fellow teams who also went on strike, the extraordinary civic engagement work of the players of the Atlanta Dream franchise and other WNBA players, which led to the historic election outcome in the Senate races in Georgia this past January. Indeed, the athlete activist movement of our time extends beyond, the professional collegiate levels, but indeed is a grassroots movement that was really galvanized by the protests that we've seen at the professional and collegiate levels. Today's movement really builds on earlier moments of athlete activism. And I'm thinking in particular of the 1960s and 70s, of course, Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, Harry Edwards, Dave Megacy, Gary Shaw, Bill Walton, Mickey Scott, Jack Scott, and others, a cross-racial activist insurgency, athlete insurgency that emerged as part of the Black Power movement and, of course, against the war in Vietnam. And some of that, of course, reverberated on our campus with the famous 1968 protests here at Columbia University. In those protests, athletes were associated with the counter-protest movement against the student and community uprising. But by 1969 and 70, athletes were participating in the campus-based movement against the war in Vietnam. So we have seen a kind of radicalization even of athletes on our campus at that time. This activist movement, again, in coordination and in response to the movement in the streets, right, is raising a number of questions that I'd like us to think about tonight. We don't have to address these questions directly, but I think they will come up in our conversation. How can we build upon the gains made by the struggles for equality and justice that have been achieved in the sports world? right? How do we acknowledge the real limits of the athlete activism that we've seen over the last couple of years with the persistent domination of white men in leadership positions throughout the sports world? And of course, the consequences of that system are showed very clearly just recently in recent cases in Major League Baseball around sexual harassment cases, the Jared Porter hiring and firing by the New York Mets, the Mickey Callaway case with the pitching coach of the Anaheim Angels. And then, of course, today's news of the resignation of Seattle Mariners CEO Kevin Mather, right? So there's real limits to what the athlete activist movement has done in the world of sports. How can the athlete activism that we've seen be harnessed into this next phase of our country's history, in the struggle for social justice, in the struggle against labor exploitation, in the struggle against homo and transphobia, patriarchy, sexism, and encroaching authoritarianism? And how do we really make institutional responses to this movement meaningful, right? Beyond just rhetorical gestures of stands against racism to real substantive institutional change and societal change? These are the kinds of questions that occurred to me as we think about our conversation tonight. I'm really delighted to be here with three distinguished alums of our university who have excelled athletically and are doing important work after their time here at Columbia. And I noticed that at least two of the panelists described their work using the term advocate. And so given that this session is really about athlete activism, I thought we could start with the conversation about what we think that is, right? Individually, each of you perhaps talk about that, right? What does it mean for you to be an athlete activist or somebody who's an activist or an advocate in the sports world? And I also wanted to know if maybe you could also reflect on your experiences at Columbia here and how those experiences contributed to your thinking about what an athlete activist is. So I'd like to start with, let's start with Alton.
Yeah, I guess if the question is, what my first memory of athlete activism was, I was around in the 60s. I know these two weren't even thought of. My colleagues were not even thought of then, but I think really watching Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, really watching Jim Brown, most of those folks go through what they went through as athletes, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and really standing up to racism as they saw it and as they lived it. That was my first, and I was 8-10 years old when I was hearing the horror stories that you couldn't stay in a hotel and you couldn't ride on the same bus, and things that are abhorrent now and were abhorrent then, and they still excelled and they still made huge impacts on all types of folks. And when I say that, that was my first experience. Activism has so many different faces that you can really make an impact by marching, but you can also make an impact by lifting one young man or woman up and helping them beat the odds. And so that was my first experience. I think it was crystallized in 1972, or I should say it was crystallized with John Carlos in the Olympics. And I just felt really empowered. I felt emboldened. I felt like for once we are standing up to the challenges, and we are sharing on a world stage that we will not tolerate any more nonsense.
Nzingha, go ahead.
Yeah, I can jump in. I would say like advocacy and activism for me is really around structure, like understanding the systems that disadvantage and mistreat people, and a lot of the time people of color, and how can you navigate them and like kind of pinpoint, okay, I can see like why this decision creates a disparity of access. For me, I grew up in a predominantly white sport, but I had like a buffer of PWF, Peter Westbrook Foundation. And so I had my community of Black athletes. But when I went back to public school in Brooklyn, I was the only elite athlete, forget elite fencer, like elite athlete, pursuing competitive sports. And so I recognized how much of a gift sport was in my life. And so growing up and with the knowledge of Peter and his legacy, it's required to be part of the program to volunteer and to teach on Saturday mornings, you know, the next generation. So I kind of grew up with this idea of like giving back, and like that it's a requirement to exist, not only through Peter, but through my mom. My mom came from the Caribbean, and there's a long legacy of activism in my family and revolutionaries. I think that's why my name is probably Nzinga. And so I have a lot of inspiration for my involvement in like equity around sports, and sports is just really where I grew up and where I saw the discrepancy of access. And so I've always wanted to, like, even when I went to Columbia almost 10 years ago when I started, I always wanted to learn, like, what is the impact of sport? Because I knew for me it was life-changing, but I wanted to understand really like how much can sport impact others' lives? Like, why don't others have, where I grew up in Brooklyn, predominantly Black neighborhood, why don't they have access to sport? What is this system that sport operates in, which looks really similar to other systems where you're excluded from access. So I always wanted to not only touch it and affect that change at a small level, but from like a structural level. And I've seen it done in terms of sport, like in other countries. There's more socialized versions of sport. It's centralized. You like access to sport, especially non-traditional sports, is universal. So it's not based on income. It's not privatized. It's not pay to play. It's accessible to everyone. So I knew, because I traveled the world and I'd been around other teams and other systems, that this is possible to recreate, you know, a world where everyone has access to all levels of sport, not just recreational, but competitive too. So that's kind of been my motivation, you know, to get involved in athlete activism, just change, like to try to affect the structure of it as much as possible.
I love that. So Alton, you know, you talked about, I'll get to you, Tyler, in a minute. I'm going to further contextualize, you know, the moment I talked about earlier, the late 60s, early 70s moment, right, with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Tommy Smith and John Carlos. And Nzingha, as a Caribbean descended person coming up in New York City, in Brooklyn, but being in a sport that's not known to have a whole lot of Black folks in it, right? It's a really fascinating story that you've laid out for us already. Tyler, how would you sort of talk about your own sort of experience and your thinking about athlete activism?
Yeah. I mean, just like, I guess for everybody, right? Like sports for me was my whole childhood. It was everything I thought, everything I did, a 3-sport athlete, basketball, baseball, football, and track when I switched over from baseball. And you don't realize how much of an impact athletes have, especially growing up, looking up, like Alton was saying, to these athletes who, you know, you want to embody, you want to be them one day. And you know that so many Black little boys and girls aspire to do those things. And I guess for me, growing up in Southern Virginia, you know, and not the best area, there's obviously some, in my experience anyway, racial disparities and whatnot. But it was always a platform that I used, one, to calm myself, come to peace, you know, step away from the outside world that, you know, negatively affected me due to my skin color, but also a place where I felt like I could speak for others and stand and make a voice for others that might not necessarily have one. And I know as for Columbia anyway, you know, one big thing that I remember is, you know, after Colin Kaepernick, no, right? Like, that impacted me looking up to one of my heroes. And a year later, I did the same thing at Columbia, on Columbia's field. And knowing the impact and the platform and the presentation that I have for other kids, just how I looked up to athletes, is important. And I don't think we should take it lightly as athletes. And it's always crazy to think about this concept of, I know we were talking about it earlier, shut up and dribble, or stay on the field and just mind your business. But no, we are, as athletes, more than our sport, right? We love our sport. We love it to death. But we are also living in a world where we have to maneuver, where we have to maintain our sanity and stand up for what's right and speak out when we think things are wrong. And so I guess in terms of athlete activism, it's doing those things. It's speaking up. It's making a representation and representing yourself for everyone to see and doing the right thing at all times. So.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things that you're saying here, resonate with what we've seen, of course, throughout the country. I mean, one of the, we highlight the big names that we see on television, but there was clearly awakening among athletes in this period that you're talking about that resonated deep down into the youth and the high school levels. And Dave Zirin, the sports writer, is writing a book precisely about the kind of grassroots activism that was inspired by Kaepernick, right? Following a lot of the principles that you laid out there, Tyler, really well. And Tyler also talked about his time at Columbia. So I was wondering if Nzingha and Alton could also reflect on that moment in this journey. Either providing opportunities or for you to think about these things in your own athletic life, in the classroom, perhaps, or maybe in a moment where you had to work through some difficult opposition, because I'm sure Tyler himself must have experienced that in that moment. There's been a big shift, of course, since last year around the response to the Kaepernick protests and athlete protests. So, Nzingha, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the Columbia period and its role in this evolution that you laid out earlier.
Yeah, when I went to Columbia, I was really excited because I had never, New York City's public school system is really segregated. And so when I went to high school at Stuyvesant, there's this long legacy, well known, of how few Black and Brown students there are at Stuyvesant. And so, my class was like no different. And so I grew up in a high school environment, like an academic environment, where I wasn't around a lot of Black people, like even in an intellectual like setting. And so when I went to Columbia, it was really cool because I was around all these Black intellectuals who were studying, basically activism a lot of the time. They were at IRS, and we went to the Black Student Union and stuff like that. And so everyone around me was kind of talking about, inequities, disparity of access, mistreatment. And so it was really inspirational to be around it in an academic sense. And so that kind of, triggered this motivation and inspired it even more. And so when I had to choose a major, I wanted to study sports, but it wasn't like you weren't there then. And so there wasn't a lot of sport, like topics to study. And so what I did was I studied political science, and I didn't study American politics because I knew I was inundated with American politics. So I picked international politics and justice. And justice is really where I kind of gravitated towards, because it was like all about the systems of fairness, and like why policies are created, and political theory, and what's the rationale behind policy. And then when I did my race and ethnicity concentration, that like went more into the history of race, of disadvantaging, disenfranchisement, of colonization, decolonization, and that kind of process. And so I kind of had I had extra resources, like educational resources, to kind of inform how I wanted to take like the sports conversation. So that kind of background, the academics of Columbia really impacted and inspired me to continue like towards policy, like and in sports policy direction.
Of course, that's music to my ears as a faculty member here who teaches race, ethnicity, in history. It's great to see that and in the world of sport. Unfortunately, those classes weren't offered when at that time, but they're offered by people like me now. But Alton, you're here in the 70s, right? So you're here, within, recent, very real memories of the 68, the late 60s moment, the 70s, right? New York City is going through all kinds of changes as well. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about how that experience here on the court, in the classroom, shaped your thinking about these questions.
Yeah, I was blessed, man, that I got to Columbia when I got there. I think it was the height of activism. You just finished, the takeover of Hamilton Hall in the late 60s. We had role models like Jimmy McMillan and Hayward Dotson, who, people forget Columbia was ranked 5th in the country in basketball, which was unheard of. We all looked up to Jimmy. And then I had some really good mentors who were really kind of what I would call the educated militants of our time on campus, Denny Moore, Chili Collins, who were playing basketball at Columbia. And I came to Columbia to major in urban studies and economics. And my goal was to figure out ways to eradicate just poor housing and the economics of what cities were like. And I got here in 75 to find that I thought it was bad in San Francisco, and got here and I was like, oh my God, like, what is this? And so, I wanted to leverage my sports ability to try and make a difference in urban centers around the country, and urban centers specifically in New York. And you did that by trying to figure out ways to financially make living in cities better. So you needed economic mobility, you needed economic empowerment. And that experience really kind of pervaded, all the way through my college experience. I was blessed that, Columbia had changed from being a really poor sports program to a high profile sports program. And anybody will tell you it was the golden era of Ivy League basketball, culminated with Penn making the Final Four, losing to Magic Johnson's team in the semifinals. We were the last team to beat Penn. We had a winning record all 3 years, but the impact we had on the community brought more people from Harlem to our games. We were far more engaged with, local residents. All of us were volunteering. I was a member of Big Brothers Big Sisters. And, at the end of the day, my goal was, how do I make an impact on the one kid or the 5 kids? I offered free basketball clinics to kids. And so at that time at Columbia, we saw a transformation and an evolution of what sports looked like. Half of our team was African American. We were really together on what it represented. And remember, the surroundings of Columbia were very different in the late 70s. In the 70s, it was still, a challenging place. It is not the Harlem you see now. I drive down 125th Street now, and I saw Red Lobster, and I was like, wait. Every restaurant on 125th Street was a local spot. There were no big box restaurants. It was a neighborhood. Now it's, I tell my wife, like, walking around Harlem, you used to ask people who were not people of color in Harlem whether they were lost. You passed 110th Street, you gotta know where you're going. So using our sports, it was part of the reason why I came to Columbia, but the real reason I came to Columbia is academically, I wanted to make an impact and use my degree to really make an impact.
I love those reflections. I'm a native New Yorker, so I, who a little younger than you, but I certainly have experienced those changes for better and for worse. And of course, where our neighborhood and our university is going to be after this pandemic is an open question. Right. I'd like to think sports can play a role in shaping some of those dynamics in the ways that you outlined here in your time here. Tyler, you talked about, of course, you're being inspired by Kaepernick and athletic protests when you were here. But I wonder if you had any other thoughts about the time you were here as it relates to these bigger questions.
I guess in terms of just like my experience at Columbia, I definitely enjoyed it, right? Like, Columbia is definitely a place where you meet people from all over the world that have different backgrounds and really challenge you as an individual to think outside the box about everything and anything. And I guess, and specifically when it comes to race, like Nzinga said, like, so many Black intellectuals and challenging you from different points of the world about race and things that, you have your own experiences, but they might not compare to others. And it may give you a different outlook on how race applies to you and how you move on a day-to-day basis. And I know, in regards to just race, Columbia isn't always perfect. I think that we always have to be honest. And it definitely could have, things have been better in terms of curriculum measures or more access for Black and brown groups. But I think that one thing we can agree on is that it does actively try anyway to push forward new classes, new departments, that like the African American department that recently come up. And I think it's just about, a constant push and a constant effort from the community, from alumni. And that's what I saw anyway. And that's what I tried to do to make a better place. Because at the end of the day, this is our home, our community, and we want the best of it. So.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that one of the things that we've seen, here over my time here since 2015 are these shifts, in terms of departmentalization of Black studies, but also just the conversation we've had, certainly since last year, no question. I mean, even events like this are a reflection of the potential for substantive change. I wanted to kind of zoom out a bit. I laid out a kind of big picture on athlete activism using my historian hat at the beginning. And I was wondering if you folks had some thoughts about how athlete activism has changed, in recent years, or, in any way that you think about it, how you historicize it yourself, either in terms of the time you've been paying attention to it, or if you thought about it in a bigger picture sense. So again, we could start maybe with Nzingha. Maybe you could talk about sort of how you've seen, the impact of activism change over time, and where do you think it might be going next?
Yeah, I haven't followed it, definitely not to the extent that you have, but I would say that I've seen a lot more people, like a broader range of people involved in trying to change their like relative spaces like for good, which is really cool. I think social media is I think activism has divided into pockets. I would say there's like pockets of people who are vocal on their platforms, and there's pockets who are community organizers, and there's pockets who are in governance, and in policy and things like that. And so I think there's different tiers of like how involved you can get, which is something I think isn't newer. I've seen a lot more acceptance of athlete protesting in the Olympic movement in particular. The U.S. Olympic Paralympic Committee in like the last couple of months recently accepted recommendations from their athlete council on racial and social justice to change the Rule 50, which says that, which similar to I forget, I think Tyler said, like the no, like, oh, shut up and dribble, basically, like the International Olympic Committee shut up and dribble rule, which is like you can't spread propaganda on the podium at the Olympics. So the U.S. Olympic Paralympic Committee has recently, kind of changed their stance on that. But to me, I think protesting is only one vehicle of, being vocal is one way to be activist. I think what you're saying, what's substantive, and going beyond protests is like, what does your board look like? Who's making these decisions? What do your national offices look like? Who's making those decisions? And then when people come in and try to change it, are you accepting? Are you resistant? Do you make it difficult, or are you empowering of that change? So I think there's lots of different levels to it, and I've been experiencing that, working in sports governance, and I'm recognizing all of the constant organizing that's really necessary to move these changes forward. But I think, like I said earlier, there's lots of tiers to it, and at the most intense tier, you're in the weeds having conversations with people nonstop, trying to move things forward in terms of policy, because policy is really what's substantive, what's sustainable, and what will what's a requirement. So it's like you have to operate this way. So
yeah, I love this notion of pockets, right? These different zones of influence that you've laid out for us here. And I definitely want to talk about this governance question a bit more, and the composition of boards a little later in the conversation. Alton, what are your thoughts about how athlete activism has changed over time?
Yeah, I will say that I am extraordinarily proud of how activism has changed. Now, social media has forced this change. It has created visibility where in the past there wasn't visibility. There's had to be kind of transparency because in the past there wasn't. You could hide things. I am proud of Tyler and Nzinga for being, you know, brave enough to really be advocates for change. So I see this as there is far less fear about putting pressure on systems. There is more pressure on people to understand there's a lineage and a legacy that has come with racism and bias against women, and that my young colleagues have no fear about speaking to and creating opportunities for discussion, and that it is cross-cultural now. You know, in the 60s, it was a primarily African American thing with some white folks who were engaged. Now, when you see different activations and activism happening, it's across the board. You have white kids, you have, you know, you have black kids, you got brown kids, you got, you know, all types. So there's less fear, more pressure, across the board support, younger audiences, kids who are 10, 11, and 12 having conversations that never in my lifetime would I think they'd be ready to have. And then add to that, you know, you've got resources you didn't have before. Now, George Floyd was was a watershed moment. I know our organization, our ownership group, like they put all their chips to the center and said, look, we have to support economic mobility. We can't be non-racist. We have to be anti-racist. We have to be against racism of all types, right? And so they invested in resources. And so I would say what I see now that I'm proudly saying is there's less fear, more pressure, more resources, and you know, quite frankly, you know, Tyler and Nzinga could give a damn about how people feel about racism. We want it gone, and we want fairness, and we want equity, and they're not frightened to talk about it. And so that is what I see, and I see it getting better on the activist side. I see more younger activists really kind of engaging.
Yeah, no, those are excellent points. I mean, you know, one of the things I say often is that, you know, what marks this generation of activists in the world of sports is, you know, is that you're seeing a wider array of participants, right? And part of that is a legacy of Title IX, right, and the growth of the women's sports industry, and then the questions that emerge out of that world as well around, you know, gender inequities and harassment issues and even questions of sexuality as well, right? So, I mean, that what's
Frank,
exciting about. I'm sorry.
Let me just say this, Frank.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, well, there's also you know, as Nzinga said, there are buckets, but there are an awful lot of people who are doing really good work around activism who you don't see, right? There's the quiet force of people who are, okay, there are those who are the public face, and then there are those who are quietly behind the scenes, implementing change, doing things that make people uncomfortable, but doing them in a more one-on-one, one-on-three setting, and they're dropping knowledge on people who didn't know. Like, you know, the microaggressions that you hear, there's more people who are dealing with them now without fear. And those quiet people are making a huge impact just as much as when people kind of gather at Barclays Center and you know, there's 10,000 people at Barclays Center. For every 10,000, for every person there, there's probably one or two people who are making a huge difference quietly, knowing that the legacy is going to need resource in order to sustain itself.
Absolutely, points well taken. You need activism operating on all levels, right? On the individual level as well, and that's hard. That in itself is hardcore organizing work, right? Tyler, what are your thoughts on these questions?
Yeah, I mean, just doing, based off of, history and whatnot, I feel that there were a handful of people back, in the early 60s and 70s, that were willing to speak up, in terms of just like being an athlete and all of that pressure, right? Making it to a platform where you finally have overcome at least a little bit of what you had to deal with. But then when you get there, right, when you think about Muhammad Ali and him speaking out and how that resulted in him going to jail and people constantly putting pressure on individuals who just wanted change, honestly, right? You think about the Olympians, and a lot of people think about the two black men, but the Australian man, after he stood there with a pen on his chest, standing in solidarity, and he lost everything after that, and he really didn't compete after that. And so we see now, right, more people are willing to stand up. And in regards to an institutional point of view, right, obviously still affecting Black and brown people. Colin Kaepernick has still not played in the NFL, right? There are things that you speak up and the institutional beings may definitely, prevent you from progressing. But in regards to what Nzingha was saying, I think the social media era has a big impact because it no longer feels like, and from my point of view anyway, that we're alone, right? You feel like you have millions of people speaking and backing you in every step you take when you have a platform like this, right? Like, and the people spoke. Colin Kaepernick got off the team, but he got a lot of money with Nike, right? People spoke and were pushing and having conversations, not even just inside of race, but in gender equality and gender pay and the women's NBA and different sports of that nature, right? So all of these things are causing more and more people to open the doors to different conversations that we wouldn't necessarily have. And then even in terms of a Columbia perspective, right? Like we have to talk about Columbia, right? Back in the 60s, right? A big thing when it comes to sports was the gym, right? People called it Jim Crow, GYM Crow, right? And that was a definitely a harsh impact when it comes to inequalities within Harlem and what that aspect looked like and access to the gym and Columbia's, institutional pressure and whatnot. But at least now we're making strides and having these conversations. We're making an effort to be public about it and speak out against racial divide and racial inequality and allowing people to have the conversation openly and candid. And I think that speaks and goes a long way in terms of where we've come from and where we are now.
Absolutely, yes. I want to shift gears a little bit to think about some things that we've touched on a couple of times, but I think warrants a sustained discussion, at least for a little bit. And this is the question of the organizational role, the role of institutions in responding and supporting athlete activism, right? So the question is, what role, responsibility do organizations, institutions like Columbia or the Nets or the IOC or the U.S. Olympic Committee in supporting athletes, right? We've touched on it. And as Alton said, part of the shifts that we've seen have been a result of pressure, as is always the case. Institutions only move when they're pressured to move, more often than not, right? But I'm also thinking about the real limits that we've seen. I'm thinking about the whole conversation that ensued around the Super Bowl with, the underrepresentation of Black coaches in the National Football League. The gross inequities when we see underrepresentation of all marginalized peoples in leadership positions throughout the sports world, right? At the amateur level, at the university level, at the professional level, right? The intransigence of white domination, I would say, in those positions. So I don't know if you had some thoughts. I mean, I could start with Alton, given that this is your world every single day right now, and thinking about what, whether in the case of the Nets or even just in a broader sense, what you think the organizational response should be to, supporting social justice causes, athlete activism, and facilitating real change.
Yeah, it's a great question. I like to think that our organization is ahead of the curve. Our ownership group understands, number one, where they own a franchise at and the impact that it has. Brooklyn is the fourth largest city in America. If you took Brooklyn on its own, it's a unique place. It is also demonstrably different than Manhattan and the Bronx and every other So I think our ownership understands the legacy of what Brooklyn is and what it stands for, the grit, the grind, the toughness. And I think there is, quite frankly, ownership has to understand the impact. Most owners consider who owns sports franchises these days, right? They're usually not people of color. They are usually, relatively speaking, no, blatantly speaking, insensitive to what happens around their arenas, around their franchises. And yet, in certain sports, 70 to 90% of the athletes who are participating are usually athletes of color. And I think George Floyd crystallized things. I think people have been avoiding some things. Our ownership group, we've been lucky. They've been investors in the Brooklyn community. They've invested a fund. They have partnered with the NBA. We are lucky that we have a WNBA team, the New York Liberty, that are well ahead of the curve in terms of, activism. I think the women of the NBA, the WNBA, are probably light years ahead of sports activism and having a huge impact. I look at the election in Georgia, where the Dream, who I'm an alum of the Atlanta Dream, they made an impact. Their athletes made a huge impact. And so I think ownership groups are starting to understand. I'm lucky that I work in an organization where our ownership group really does understand, and they put their resources where their mouth is. They, quite frankly, they make statements and then they follow it up with investments. Our organization evolved. So the front office on the business side has evolved dramatically since our new CEO came in, and he understood the impact. And, I'm always proud to see progress. I'm not saying every sports franchise has made the kind of progress we've made, but I'm proud that BSE in Brooklyn has made the investment, our staff at the arena. So I would say, Professor, that I think ownership groups do have a substantial say in what their environment is like, what diversity looks like, what their staff looks like, how they treat their women's staff, their gender, how they treat the LGBTQ staffers. They have to know that the impact is, the more diverse your team is, the better the results.
And Nzinga, yeah. So a similar question to you. I think Alton's laid out some, concrete ways in which he's seen this, change in his organization. The Olympic movement has also been criticized on very similar grounds, right? I mean, you already alluded to Rule 50. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about, again, given the work you've been doing, what around organizational, institutional responses to facilitate real change.
Yeah, I think unfortunately it happens under pressure. A lot of these changes happen under pressure. It gets to a point where like everyone was making statements about George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery a few months ago, and they were under so much pressure to say something, from their athletes. A lot of their athletes are people of color. A lot of their most successful athletes are people of color, and they feel devalued when it's not respected. It's not their experience isn't celebrated. Their experience is protected. Their experience isn't. They feel not valued, and so it's unfortunate that it's only under pressure that kind of change is inspired, especially when there's stimulation to do it beforehand. But at least I guess better late than never. And so I think it's been slow, but at least there's some understanding that there is change that's needed. It's just really tough when you're on the other side and you kind of have been the advocate, and then it's only relevant when the world is like, oh, okay, we recognize that this is an issue now, but that's the reality.
But I would say the work that you're doing in Nzinga and the work you're doing, Tyler, is a continuing evolution. And your voices are now, you're at least at the table. You know, my generation, we didn't get to the table. Y'all are at the table now, you know, and you guys are making things happen. And that's what evolution is. Like, you know, sometimes it is like what we do in the NBA and the WNBA. I'm proud to be part of that family, is not what the NFL and Major League Baseball and the National Hockey League do. I'm not saying it's better or worse. It's just different and far more aggressive in its view. And so I'm hoping that Nzinga and Tyler carry on and continue to evolve the message of it is not acceptable for anything other than fair and equitable opportunities to do what you love, because that's not always been the case. It's not always been, you know, in fencing, I'm sure it's not always been fair and equitable. In basketball, it's not fair and equitable, and we get 75% of the players are players of color, and it's not equitable. You know, that's what, 8 NBA coaches, 8 GMs out of 30. We still got work to do.
Yeah, no, and thing I agree. It's disheartening when you only see change in response to pressure. You know, at the same time, it also allows us to see that pressure works. You know, or it can work sometimes. You know, and it seems to have been working a little bit more in recent months. You know, I'm thinking about Bill Rowan, the New York Times, the former New York Times sports columnist. He had this really beautiful video that came out. I think it was the day of the Super Bowl, in which he was, you know, critiquing the NFL for refusing again to hire Black coaches. And he said to me, very simple but profound. He said, "You folks need to make the right decision now so that you don't have to apologize 50 years from now." You know, like, you know, and it was just a profound thing that somehow still doesn't set in more often than not. But that's a form of pressure. I think what journalists are doing now, people like Howard Bryant, among many others, are really taking up the cause in terms of historicizing and helping us understand activism in the past and present, and then also being advocates themselves. You know, so Tyler, I mean, your sport world was football. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about how this operates in the football context, or since your time here at Columbia, thoughts about, again, institutional responses, how we can support efforts for change, and how those institutions can actually create the conditions for real change.
I mean, I'm gonna piggyback off what everybody said in terms of just like pressure is real, right? And it's very unfortunate that that's what it takes, right? Because at the end of the day, like, yes, we're athletes, and yes, I know we have a platform, but that doesn't mean that we want that pressure, right? And I want to make that very clear, right? Like, I want to play football and I want to enjoy it and I want to focus all my energy on it. But I can't do that when I'm always constantly thinking about the disparities, the inequalities, the deaths, the pain, the anger, crying. And I can tell you, I cried a few times throughout my experience because of the racial pressures of the world, right? Aside from being at an Ivy League school, aside from being a D1 athlete. And it's a lot of pressure. And it would make it a lot easier if institutions just stepped up and made a difference, stepped up and make a change. And it always baffles me, right? In my mind, it's just like diversity is so important, not just for Black people and brown people and people of color, right? It impacts the minds of white individuals where they can be better leaders. They can be better people. They can impact changes where they hold positions and ultimately create a whole new world, right? And that just includes talking to more people that are not like you, being around people that have different opinions, views, different backgrounds. And I think that's so important, right? And I was actually talking about today, actually, about the Rooney Rule in football, and like how that impacts society. And there are a lot of people who, you know, still disagree with it, right? The aspect of giving Black people or Black coaches the opportunity to interview when a spot is vacant for a job, right? And I don't know why we contemplate that, right? When we know the history of our country, when we know the history of sports and how much was taken away from Black people and not allowed for Black people to progress in, but yet we're just trying to get to a point where it's an equal and equitable playing field. So we definitely have a lot of work to do, but institutional help does wonders if they do it the right voice and the right message.
Tyler, I'm so glad you you made the initial comment. I mean, all your comments there, but sort of about like, I just want to go play football, right? Like, so you named the pressure of, you know, the kind of psychological toll that being the truth teller often carries with it. That's something that makes this generation, if I might speak to Alton here, you know, distinct. The ways in which today's activists acknowledge self-care, right? In ways that, you know, even folks in my era, I'm a Gen Xer, really did not, you know, and so I really appreciate that comment that you made, Tyler, because it is absolutely true. We should just have the ability to just do something we love, right? And yet we often don't, whether it's in the sports world or any parts of our society. So we're coming down to a close already. We're almost at time. I wanted to kind of give you all three an opportunity just to maybe address one of the questions that was posed to us really quickly. You know, we only have 4 minutes left. About, you know, what can Columbia student athletes do, you know, around these questions moving forward, right? You know, imagine some of the people in our audience are people who are student athletes now, or students at Columbia now, or even other alums who maybe experienced Columbia in ways that were similar and different than yours. Maybe, you know, maybe each of you take about a minute about, you know, to speak to this question of how Columbia student athletes themselves can raise their voices or feel inspired in ways that you have in your own lives. Start with Alton.
Yeah, just really 3 quick points. Number one, use your opportunity to speak. Do not let it pass you by. Number two, invest your time and energy in lifting 1 or 10 or 20 people up, because activism is not just complaining or moaning. It's lifting and helping and supporting our people or any people that have been disadvantaged. And then the third thing, unfortunately, the biblical part of this is, to whom much is given, much is required. So understand that, you know, get yourself in good trouble. You know, use John Lewis's line to put yourself in good trouble and speak when you see things that are out of line.
Nzinga.
Yeah, I would say I want to talk about the question about like what would I have done differently in school. I wish I had done more governance, been more involved in governance and leadership, student leadership, and organizing. So I think it's an incredible skill. And that's really like how you can affect change, because when you're in the front speaking, it's really difficult to influence decisions. It's when you have like a coalition of people who are, you know, on the same page, can hold ground and like talk to more people and get the message across. That's how I think you can really affect change on a big scale. And organizing is a skill. And so I wish I'd gotten more involved in like governance and student leadership and stuff like that, and try to like assume like a leadership role in something I cared about beyond sports. And I would say, just on another, like a similar note, like advocate for yourself and advocate for other people. I think, as Tyler said, like there are a lot of pressures involved in being the other in predominantly white spaces, and it's often stressful. And I think sometimes the easiest way is to kind of brush it off, but I think you kind of have to do some self-reflecting. This is from my own experience, but and really like creating boundaries and like what you feel is acceptable and not acceptable treatment, and advocating for yourself and others.
Thank you. Tyler, you have the last word.
Big pressure. No, I think I'll make a 3-point. One, don't just be an athlete, right? There's so I know it's and I don't want to say it, but I have to, right? There's so many things going on in the world. There's so many things that are going on campus, you know, and like Nzinga said, like be a part of different leadership groups, join different clubs, go outside of the athletic circle, right? Columbia is there not just for you to be an athlete and have a platform for that, but to grow and learn more about yourself than you might have ever had. And that is impacted by the people you meet and the groups you join. 2, I would say, like Alton said, reach back and pull somebody up. That's so important, right? Like we have each other and we have to keep uplifting each other one by one until we make a more equitable world, an equal world. And 3, don't settle, right? You deserve respect. You're valuable, and treat yourself as such. Don't settle, don't settle, don't settle. That's what I got.
Don't settle, good trouble. Sounds like work we have to all do. I want to thank Alton Bird, Tyler Holmes, and Nzingha Prescod for their time, their insights, and for the inspirational work that you're doing and that you've done. And I look forward to seeing more inspirational work from you in the coming months and years. I truly benefited from this conversation. I want to thank you for joining us. And I want to thank the audience for joining us on this webinar. I think we had an important conversation, a multi-generational conversation around athletic activism, which I think is productive and wonderful. And I think we'll just end it there. And I thank you all and looking forward to seeing you in person, perhaps sometime in the not too distant future. Take care.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.